Welcome, everyone, to the Grants Workshop and Budget Walkthrough and Q&A. Thank you for joining us today. If you were able to attend our Grants Workshop last month, you learned a lot from our team about grants, and they covered everything from locating funding to best practices. There was a section as well on the budget that just kind of covered some terms. Sorry, my captioning arrow is kind of funny today. There we go. If you missed any part of that presentation, there will be a link dropped in the chat shortly. We have someone who is monitoring the chat as well. So if you have questions that come up while we go through this presentation, we can go ahead and take them as they come, or we can also save some towards the end. There will be plenty of time for questions, so no worries about that. And moving on, I'd like to introduce ourselves. There we go. So my name is Debbie Montenegro, and I'm the Deputy Director for NNLM Region 3. And we also have Sheila Scott with us, who is our Project Support Specialist. And I'm very excited to say that we just hit Sheila's 1-year anniversary of working with us. So happy work anniversary to Sheila. It's very exciting. Yeah, so on that, I wanted to just do a brief mention and a thank you to Margie Shepard, our Community Engagement Coordinator, for being our tech support today. And our format for this session is quite different from the session that we did on January 22nd, which is the webinar I referred to earlier. That one was more over the overall process of applying to a grant, specifically ours, but also just in general. This is more of an informal walk through the budget form, and we will also be dropping a link to in the chat for that form. That form is really what the walkthrough is for today, and that form is one that is specific to NNLM Region 3 and also some NIH grants. So we're going to begin with a quick overview of some main budget principles that Sheila will introduce, and then we're going to give you that practical walkthrough. I would like to encourage you whenever we get to my section, and I'll remind you again, to download the budget from the link that we put in the chat once we get there so that you can follow along. I will have screenshots on the slideshow simply because it was easier to do a screenshot than to try and just maneuver around a whole document on the screen because some people get dizzy if you're moving around a lot, things a lot. So we will do that. And I'll remind you again in a little bit. The last portion of the presentation, after we've discussed the terminologies and the walkthrough of the budget form, that last portion will be completely open for Q&A. So if you have any questions after we've gone through everything, feel free to ask us. Our contact information is available. You can message us in the chat. You can private message us in the chat. You can also email us, and that information is in the chat as well. You can see our email, our office email address, the slides from today, and the grants webinar link to the recording from the webinar that just happened like a couple weeks ago. All right, so moving on. Let's see here. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Sheila in a second, but before I do, I wanted to introduce her a little bit more. Sheila is our project support specialist, and she brings a wealth of experience as a contract and budget analyst from the Burnett School of Medicine at TCU, a senior auditor at the Defense Contract Audit Agency, and as an officer in the United States Navy. So welcome, Sheila.
Good morning. Thank you, Debbie, for that introduction. I am thrilled to be here, and thank you, Margie, for your help today. And thank you all for taking time out of your day to spend time with us. We hope this will prove helpful for you. Again, like Debbie said, this is my 1-year anniversary, so 1 year and a couple of days, and I'm so ecstatic to be here with you today. No joking. So with no further ado, let's go to the next slide. We're going to jump right into a refresher of what we talked about, and you may remember me from our workshop a couple of weeks ago, and we'll talk about the cost principles. As a refresher, the cost principles for any federally funded program, the cost principles are consistent. The funding that we provide to the awardees must adhere to federal guidelines that specify what types of costs are allowable and able to be allocated to federally sponsored agreements like this one with NNLM 3. These governing guidelines are called the cost principles. So let's talk about allocable. Expenses charged to the grant are in proportion to the benefit received by the project. So, for example, if someone is going to commit 10% of their time to the project of this grant, we expect to see 10% of their salary allocated to this project. And also, it has to be allowable. Costs that are allocable put to the project conform to the funding opportunity conditions, are legal, consistently treated as direct or indirect, and are reasonable and justifiable. So if you identify something as a direct cost in one invoice, we expect to see that allocated as a direct invoice in a direct cost in the next invoice. So you must be consistent. So that is also another leg of the cost principle. So you can also look this up in section 7.9 of the NIH grant policy. A good place to start, though, as any project grant, is the RFP, the request for proposal, because the allowability of costs are subject to the requirements specified in the terms and conditions of the award. So I would consult that first if you're looking for something to be allowable or allocable. Next slide, please. For example, we specify restrictions on certain items that you want to charge back to us. Food, promotional items, and furniture are not allowable expenses. We also provide some examples of other items on the next slide, such as clothing and commemorative items such as pens, cups, folders, folios, lanyards, things that you would typically get at a conference. We put restrictions on what's allowable per our NIH grants policy statement. Next slide. And so you're probably wondering, what's allowable? The trip to Las Vegas for all of you is probably Uncle Sam is not going to pay for that. But here's some examples that you can for sure identify that are not allowable per the NIH guidance that we just provided for you. Cost of entertainment. As I alluded to earlier, you can't take your team to the movies or throw a party with this funding. Personal expenses. You likely wouldn't pay for your personal groceries or gas or mortgage with this. Alcoholic beverages. With my experience with the Department of Defense working on proposals and grants, this is across the board as well. Alcoholic beverages are not allowable. Membership dues, some other cost examples are proposals that are not allowable. There are exceptions for food. It can be allowable if it is for a staff member traveling for purposes of the grant, and they get reimbursed for meals as per the rules of your institution. For example, our university would allow us per diem based on GSA, the government rates. Next slide, please. Reasonable. This is something that's more straightforward than the other, allowability, allocability, and consistently. This is pretty much referring to common sense. When you're considering a charge or an expense, when you're creating your budget for your project, think about the cost of this expense. Is it something that I would pay for? If someone were to come to your house and make a repair, say, on a wall or some kind of thing that needs repairing in your home, and they say, okay, here's the quote, it's going to cost $1 million. That's not going to be reasonable, and you're probably going to give the person a side eye. So think about these things when you're constructing your budget with a reasonable person with common sense, pay this much for this. Is this going to land me on an episode of American Greed type thing? So think about this as you're constructing your budget, reasonableness. So this is something that you want to make sure you think about in addition to the cost principles when you're constructing your budget. Next slide, please. Direct costs. Now, this is something that's easily identifiable with your specified project. They are allowable expenses in line with the cost principles, things like direct salary and wages, the people who are working on directly on the project, materials and supplies. These are things that you're going to use directly in your project that's going to lead you to uh, accomplishing the goals and missions of the project. They're directly traceable. You can create an audit trail per se that yes, indeed, we used this pen or this paper or whatever the material and supply is directly to this project. We can say that this person's salary, whatever percentage was allocable to the project, we can trace it directly to this project. So ultimately, any direct costs you charge should go toward the scope of work or the program that you propose in your submission. For instance, travel is another example. Travel support is being requested. What benefits the travel provide to the project? Think about that. Is that trip to Paris in Europe, is it directly related to this project? You know, can it be directly traced? So that's another example. I mentioned in the webinar on the 22nd of January that you want to be sure that you're being a good steward of the funds that you're awarded. In this case, it's the taxpayers' money. So we want to make sure that the money that you're using and requesting is going to put you in a good light, that you're utilizing the funds as you should be. Next slide, please. So we talked about in our grant workshop last month about what we expect, the categories of a budget construction. You have your salaries and wages, your fringe, your travel, material supplies. These are typical categories that we expect to see in the construction of your budget. IDC rate, indirect cost rate, that is something that we also expect to see. Now, if you don't have a negotiated rate within your institute, we have something that's 10% that we allocate for you. And we'll go into more depth about that when we talk about your report form. But this is something that you want to make sure that, do you have the categories for the budget when you're constructing it? These are things that we typically want to see or need to see. Next slide, please. Now, what I just showed you was the numbers on an Excel spreadsheet or whatever format. In our case, it's going to be an Excel spreadsheet. So those are the numbers. Now, the other part of the budget that we talked about in the last workshop are, what is the story behind the numbers? And that is otherwise known as your budget narrative and also known as your budget justification. So this is where you're going to tell us, why do you need it, when you intend to use it, how much you're allocating, and other details that you think would help justify your asking for what you're asking for in your proposal. Next slide, please. So this is where you're going to explain a written explanation and some documents that describe what you're requesting. It should include a salary breakdown. You may want to include quotes, the storytelling behind it. It's commonly referred to, as I mentioned before, interchangeably as the justification and the narrative. A properly constructed justification is both detailed and concise, while also ensuring that the reviewer has a fully painted, encompassing picture of your financial needs for this project. This is one thing I would highly advise you to do when you're constructing your budget narrative. I would probably have someone who's not connected, in addition to those who are connected to this proposal, but someone who's not connected to the proposal, have them read side by side, read the budget narrative, what you've written and what you're requesting as far as the numbers side of it and the budget Excel spreadsheet. So looking at those side by side, can this person read the narrative and it tells the story of the numbers that you've calculated in the budget Excel spreadsheet? And if they can read it easily, then you've more than likely done a great job. And if they're asking a lot of questions or want more details or clarifications, we are more than likely, as the funders, are going to have probably the same questions or trouble following the narrative as it reconciles to the budget spreadsheet itself. So also another point is, it is no time to introduce, say, something new. So the numbers that you have talked about and told the story about in your narrative, I should see those same numbers reflected in your spreadsheet. So if I can't find, say, $5 over here for whatever this expense is, I can't find it in your Excel spreadsheet, then you may want to retool it or rethink, do we need this in the narrative, or have we left something out? So that's two tips that I would give you to follow as you're constructing your narrative and your Excel spreadsheet. Have someone double check you and include someone who's not, say, included in the process. If they can follow it, more than likely, we can follow it as well. Next slide, please. Another tip that I would give you is, when in doubt, reach out. If you have any questions about the process or the numbers not adding up to what, say, your award is or what you're requesting, if you just need someone to hold your hand or walk you through as you prepare, as Debbie said earlier, please reach out to us. Contact us via email or call us. We are more than happy to help you because we want you to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. And we really want you to succeed making a difference in your community. So they can be tricky, so don't be afraid to ask your funders questions. And this you can apply not only to this grant proposal process, but any other funder out there that you're applying for funds from. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions because they want you to be successful, just like we do. At this point, I am going to hand this over to Debbie. But the most important thing I want you to be mindful of is that if you're in doubt, reach out. There is no question. If we don't know it, the answer to it, we will find the resources to help you. And we provided some resources in the chat and also on our website. Without further ado, I'll hand this over to Debbie. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sheila. That was great. All right, I will just give a moment here to see if there are any questions so far. And as we do that, I'll just move forward to the next slide. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. All right, so just to start off, again, we hope you had a chance to download the budget form that we've put in the chat. It will be helpful to have it open as we walk through the different screenshots of it. Again, the purpose of this slideshow is not necessarily so much to look at these screenshots, but to just help you, guide you, and let you know which section we're covering. So again, if you'd like to click on that link in the chat, open up that budget form so you can follow along, that would be great. And if not, no worries, we will have screenshots, but it might just be helpful to you. All right, so to cover what we will be walking through, what we did was put together both a fictional budget and a fictional budget form. The budget form is what is linked to, and it is the Excel spreadsheet that is required for NNLM Region 3 grants. It is the RR form, as we refer to it. And when I say we, our executive director created a modified fillable spreadsheet version of the form that is required. And the idea for this is that it would make it easier for you as the applicant to be able to fill in a sheet that's fillable and modified to be fillable versus trying to kind of start from scratch. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. And the budget justification, again, as Sheila had discussed, is the written narrative portion that provides the justifications and descriptions for everything that is in the spreadsheet. So for whatever items you're asking or requesting funds for, you have a number amount allotted in the spreadsheet, and then you also have a written justification explaining why you need that object. So those are two different forms, and one is more numbers based, and the other one is more based on the written and justification portions of your budgets. So just trying to clarify, those are two different things. All right, so this is just an overview, eagle's eye view screenshot of the budget form itself. And you'll notice it looks a little bit different than what we've had in the past. Again, we've tried to make this modifiable and fillable. So you'll note that there are different shaded cells. The gold shaded cells are where you will be entering information. The gray shaded cells are where it will auto-calculate the different numbers. So just starting off the bat, you do not want to insert anything into the gray shaded cells. And I might mention this later on again, because those are the cells that auto-calculate in this modifiable form. So you only want to be entering information into the light goldish yellow cells, not the gray ones. So hopefully that's a little bit clear. And again, we'll be zooming into each section here in a second, but it might be helpful to have it open as well. All right, so here is a screenshot of the first section. We decided to also annotate this budget and create like an example of it, which we'll see in a little bit. And so all what you need to do if you want to create an annotated budget for yourself, and all that means is that you're adding notes. So if you want to add notes for yourself to help you as you go along the budget, you can do this. It's not required. Annotating your budget is not required at all. This is just a suggestion if you want to add notes for yourself. So what you can do is you just click on the first column, hit insert, and you start to annotate each section. If you do it that way, it won't affect any of the auto calculations we talked about earlier. So you can type in your notes. If you scroll over to the right, you can check to see that all of your cumulative totals will still load correctly, even if you add a column on the left in Excel. So again, you can kind of test that out and see if it works for you. Again, it is not required to annotate your budget at all. That's not something that we require. It's just it helps some people to be able to add notes for themselves in their budget. Oh, yes. Okay. And I see a comment in the chat. Yes, great. I'm glad that you're able to come back in. Awesome. All right. So, oh, moving on. Sorry, I've got two screens that are moved differently than usual. So I will go back here. Okay, there we go. Awesome. Okay. So here is our example of the annotated version. Um, and you'll see that on the left, we have just some examples from the presentation that Sheila had given during the January 22nd presentation and a little bit that we covered today. So you see that we have the definition of allocable entered into that first column on the left. And that's just to remind ourselves while we're going through the budget of what can be put in there. Again, this is just if it'll help you out. You don't necessarily need to do this. But so for an example, we put, allocable means that we are only charging a proportionate amount to the grant that is in line with the ratio of work that is being done. All that means is that if we put someone in at 50% of their time, we should only be requesting 50% of their time, right? The equivalent of that to what we're charging to the grant. All right, so for both sections A and B, we've already pre-populated this with some different people. So again, this is just an example. This isn't real at all. It's just an example. And we've got our senior key personnel filled in section A. We've got B, other personnel filled in as well. You'll note those are actually two different sections. And what generally happens is that in your section A, senior key personnel, you'll have someone who is the project lead or leads. Sometimes some projects will have more than one person as a lead. Oftentimes you'll have someone who might be considered the PI, the principal investigator. That can be someone who might be influential in helping get the project off the ground or helping to promote the project. But for whatever reason, they might only be minimally involved and they might not request salary for themselves. So you can still put that person in there because they might have a large influence on perhaps getting the project started or getting, whatever necessary permissions for the project, but they're not necessarily charging anything. So you can put that in there still. So we have Bremy in as the project role director. Let's just say they're the PI too, right? And then we put them in at calendar month 0. So that's because they're still contributing to the project in different ways, but they're not necessarily requesting salary. So we can put them in here at just $0. And then we have underneath, we have Jubilation Lee, who's the program lead. Again, we have her requested salary, fringe benefits, and funds requested. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those mean in a second. And again, so that section A is your senior, your key personnel, the people who are uh, you know, doing a huge part of the project or leading it. And then section B, other personnel. So you might have people in other roles who are supporting the project that you're working on. Those people will go under B, other personnel. All right, so in our example, we've already figured out the base salaries for each role. And we're going to say, that each one of them is contributing the equivalent of 3 calendar months. And again, the previous webinar that's linked to in our chat goes a little bit more into depth about what calendar months are and how those are calculated. Your own organizations may have rules about how you can designate or how much you can designate for fringe benefits. So fringe benefits generally covers things like health insurance, other things outside of salary for the person. So if you're hiring someone, not only do you have to cover their salary, but you have to cover their fringe benefits. So generally, a staff person costs more to the company than just their salary. It's these other benefits as well. So the budget makes room for that. The budget says, hey, here's the requested salary, but also the fringe benefits for each staff person. So you can enter that in. Again, the fringe benefits your organization likely has, you might want to ask your HR, your accounting office, they'll have designated percentages for different positions. So, for example, at our institution, we have different percentages based on whether someone is faculty, staff, or part-time. And that percentage is what's put in under to calculate the fringe benefits. So you can see here we have fringe rate under the golden yellow section towards the right. So fringe rate, that's where you put in your institution's designated percentage for that staff. So for this example, we're putting 10%. Your numbers can vary. Again, this is just an example, but I've seen like 20, 30% in real life. But just for this case, we put an example of 10% fringe rate for jubilation leave. So at a fringe rate of 10%, you can see that that takes 10% of the requested salary and adds that in fringe benefit. So as you can see on the screen, if we have a staff person with their base salary, we figured out, calculated how much time they're going to spend an effort towards this project. We can then calculate the salary that we want to request. In addition to that, we have for a percentage of fringe benefits, we can add how much we'll request for that, add that together, and that's what you get as your funds requested total for each person. So you can see that even though jubilation leave salary is only at 3 calendar months, $12,500 plus the fringe benefit, what we're actually asking for is $13,750 for that one staff member. And that's including their salary and their fringe benefits. All right. So for section B, just a note, if you're in a smaller organization and you don't have this huge project team just at your disposal, you may only have one or two people listed here. You might not have many people. Maybe your project lead is doing the majority of the work for this particular project, or perhaps if your project is from a larger organization, sorry, if you're working on a project in a larger organization, you may have several other personnel who are contributing at like 5% each. So it might look different based on your project, which is why I emphasize that this is just an example because, your institution, the size of your institution, the size of your project, the number of people disposable to work on your project, that all varies and depends on your own institution. So this isn't to say that you can only have two people and see your key personnel or anything like that. This is just an example. All right. And so again, making notes for yourself here to help you with the calculations. And I'll reiterate again that you will often be switching between the budget form and the budget justification and the proposal itself because you want to make sure that everything matches up with each other. So if someone is reading the budget form, they should be able to tie it back to something in the budget justification that tells them why that object or thing or staff person is needed. And then every single thing that's in the budget form and in the budget justification should be reflected in the original proposal narrative. And so what you don't want to happen is you don't want to write something in your proposal and forget to put it in your budget, because then that means that likely isn't going to happen because it's not being funded, right? And the whole point of the budget is to request the funds for each component of your project. All right, so again, here's an example of a budget justification and what it might look like. We've got section A here. And so as you can see, we were just talking about section A, senior key personnel. We had two people listed, Remy and Jubilation. And so you can see now that we have now listed out what their positions are and what they will be doing on the grant. People vary in how much they write in these sections. Some people will write a paragraph for each staff member. Again, there aren't exact parameters for this, but more just generally make sure that it matches up to what you've written and that there's sufficient information to justify that this staff member is necessary for the completion of the project. And so you can see here we have, Remy is director, provides general oversight to the program lead. And no salary will be requested, so we have zero for them. And then jubilation lead will be our program lead and primary project manager. And so little descriptions of what those people do. So again, budget justification, you want to have a description and a justification for everything that is in the budget form. All right, so back to the budget form. We can see that everything matches now. We have our numbers. Hopefully they match. We're going to be going back and forth between budget justification and budget form. In your annotated notes, if you choose to have them, you might write some reminder definitions. Like we talked about, writing for yourself, allocable means this, and just any reminders you might need. So we'll go back now to section B of the budget justification. So if you're looking at the budget RR form on your screen, if you have it open, you can yourself kind of match up and see how all these compare. So with the budget justification, this is the example for section B, other personnel. So for this project, we have a program assistant, part-time staff person who will dedicate themselves to this project for 3 months. And so we have the requested salary at the calendar months and their fringe rate all calculated here. And then we have the total other personnel. So total other personnel, that number would total everyone that's being requested. So again, like I mentioned before, you can have one person, you can have multiple people under this section, and you would want to add up everyone's totals, which includes their requested salary and their fringe rate benefits all together. And as you can see here, we've got Douglas Ramsey under section B. So I'll just stop here for a minute and just give a couple seconds if anyone has any questions so far. Again, having the budget form open on your own screen might be helpful as well to just kind of follow along. The screenshots are more just to help you track where we are on the form. All right. Again, don't be shy if you have any questions. I'll keep going. So again, we talked about fringe rates, how those can be found within your own institution. So hopefully we're all clear on sections A and B and how those are added together. All right, so moving on to section C, D, and E of the budget form. So you can see here we have equipment. Equipment is defined by NIH policy as referring to like large lab equipment or capital equipment acquisitions of over $5,000. So generally that section is for large research projects, which if you've seen our RFPs, you'll understand that that's not really the point of our projects. And so we generally wouldn't have anything going under equipment unless you were buying something perhaps like a Charlie cart. Those are a little more expensive. But most of the time, this is talking about like big lab equipment. And then under travel, we are allowed to use travel funds, but all of the travel funds must have an outreach purpose that directly supports the project. So when we talk about that section, make sure that, like we said, it's justified. Is it like Sheila was saying, is it necessary for the project? Um, and let's see here. Hmm, there we go. Okay. Um, Sorry, I got distracted. I saw in the chat. What if you need to change the percent of effort a few months into the year? Okay, so this depends on your funder. If you need to change the percent of effort of a few months into the year, e.g. 10% to 20%, if you already know you will need to do that, you can put those calculations into your budget and budget justification and just describe in your budget justification and say like, oh, so-and-so is going to dedicate 10% of time for this amount of time and 20% amount of time, this amount of time. And then for the budget form, that might be a little more difficult, but just make sure that the total still equals out to what your total is in the budget justification. Um, let's see here. The budget assumes full time for the months as an individual is engaged in the project. Person will spend 20% of their time. How would you calculate months into these hours? Okay. Yeah. So the fillable form is something that we're using to help out, but there actually is a form itself that's on its own that doesn't have the auto calculations. If you're finding that the modifiable form isn't adjusting to like very specific numbers, then you can use that form instead, and we can send that out to you. But hopefully, it should be able to account for all of that. Again, we're just using whole examples to make it easier, but the spreadsheets should be capable of being able to withstand those numbers. And also the description of calendar months, it's not like 3 calendar months is not saying that the person is going to necessarily work just 3 months in the year. What that's saying is that and I think people in the chat understand because you're asking in percentages. So I think you get it, is that, it's just a percent of their time. So their percent of their time is equivalent to them working 3 months out of the year. And that's covered a little bit in more detail in the January 22nd webinar. I hope that answered the question. I hope I understood what you were asking there. Okay, awesome. All right, so back to travel. So when it comes to travel, because we are federally funded, we go by the designated GSA rates to determine how much can be spent on lodging allotment, mileage rates, daily per diem allowed. Per diem is pretty much the only mechanism we have for our grants that allows for the funding of food on projects. So generally, food is not an allowable cost, except when it comes to staff who are directly working on the project and who are traveling and obviously need funds for food because they are working, right? And they're working and they're traveling. So we do have per diem, and that per diem is designated by the GSA rates. So if you are unfamiliar with the GSA rates, um, you can look it up at www.gsa.gov. And they will have travel and they will have like different rates for, again, lodging, per diem, those standard rates. And you can look up the rates by city or zip code, sorry, by state and city or zip code. So the GSA rates will vary by where you're going. So the GSA rate for somewhere like New York might be much higher than somewhere um, like New Mexico or something. Like, it'll vary depending on the city. So you'll want to look up the GSA rates for the specific place that you're going to. Thank you, Sheila, for adding that in the chat. And again, this is like a really just very specific note, but if you are going to an event, say like you're presenting at a conference or something, and they provide a meal to you, then that is subtracted from the per diem that's given out because you have been provided food. So per diem is really only if you aren't being provided meals and you're traveling for the work. Um, and again, I think that was covered a little bit more in the past webinar, but if you have any questions about travel, feel free to ask because there's a lot of little nuances when it comes to travel. And again, our grant only allows domestic travel. Again, this probably varies by your funder on what is or isn't allowable. But for our grant, it includes just our domestic. And you can see there are notes, including Canada, Mexico, and US possessions. But domestic travel costs is really what we're allowed to do. We're not really allowed to do so much international travel because the NNLM is a national network. And so our service is to the nation and different regions within the nation. All right, so section E is participant training support costs. This section is only there because this is a required section of the generalized NIH budget forms, but this category doesn't really apply to our grant, so we're just going to leave that blank. And you can see if you're interested in NIH grants or other federal grants, you can find more information about this section E in the NIH grants policy statement about how you might use it, because there are research projects where people can pay for, tuitions and fees and health insurance for postdocs and research and things like that. But again, our projects are more, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, but we are focusing more on health information outreach projects. And so outreach and education is a different approach than research and clinical studies. And so that's why ours varies a bit in how we fill out these forms, which is why we're doing this presentation. All right, so now you see the budget justification section of what we just covered, section C, D, and E. So for under equipment, we just put NA. And the reason why we did it this way, again, there's no specific way you must lay out the budget justification, but we're just trying to show you an organized way to do it that will help you better fill it out. For us, we've found that putting in the section, even if we're not using it, just helps to retain that alphanumeric organization that we have in the budget. So, in our form, if we skip equipment, then travel might become section C, and then that gets confusing. So we just put in section C as equipment, but we're just not using it. So we'll put NA, and then we go to section D is travel. So that just might make it a little bit clearer. All right, and so you can see here for any travel that you must do for the project, you'll want to write where you're going, when you're going, how much it's going to cost to go, and then a justification for why you're needing to travel for the project. And so this you might want to have a little bit more detail than what we have in this example. We just kind of just made this generalized example. As mentioned, this fictional project plan, two many health programs in the cities above will be conducted at two YMCA locations. Costs are calculated based on GSA rates. And so you'll want to explain, why you're going there, why you're needing to go there, who will be going there, which staff members will be going, how many. What dates will they be going? And again, we ask for this because the dates of whatever travel you do must be within the project time frame. So in the past, we've had, our project will go through, let's say, for example, um, June of this year until April of next year, and then we'll have people ask for travel that happens after that. And so the funding of this project can only cover the timeline of the project. It can't cover any travel that would happen afterwards because then that's outside of the purview of the project. And hopefully that's clear. But I can understand how some people might think like, oh, well, if I'm doing this project, I'm traveling for it, then I can get it covered by the grant. Even if it's after, but that's not how it necessarily works, unfortunately. It has to be retained within the timeline of the grant. So if the grant is from, let's say, now until the end of the year, it can't cover travel for the following year. Um, so hopefully that makes sense. But again, if you can include these breakdowns, both, in the budget justification sections, like a little grid, perhaps having like the actual, when, where, how, why, and then the explanation and justification. And then again, we have section E, participant trainee support costs, and we just have an A for that because that's not really something that's utilized on our grant. All right, so back to the RR budget form. We have the cumulative total section on the very far right. If you have it open right now, you'll see it if you scroll all the way. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this section is not really one that you're filling in. It is just there to show you that it's autofilling and uh, auto calculating. So make sure not to enter anything into here, but what it's there for is to just help you track all the total numbers that are being added when you're adding them in the gold shaded cells. So hopefully this can help you just kind of see how it's auto-populating. And then if you see anything that, looks a little off, you can go and check your other your yellow shaded cells to make sure that everything is matching across the board. All right. We're almost there, y'all. We're getting there. All right. So other direct costs, which is section F. So for section F, we've got multiple subcategories that fill into the other direct cost section. And so you'll see here we've got materials and supplies, which can include, printing things out, other kind of like folders, I don't know, things that you would need to do outreach or education. You have publication costs, consultant services. That one comes up a lot. If you're needing like someone to design something for you, different consultant services. There's ADP computer services. That's if you're needing like software or something like that. And then subawards and consortium and contractual costs. Um, this one we may or may not be using, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next couple of slides. And you can kind of see just the rest of the categories listed there. So we'll be walking through some of these. Again, on the left, if you're annotating notes for yourself, you might annotate like some of the descriptions or definitions of the different sections. So, other direct costs, it says you can specify additional items in this section if it doesn't fall into one of the pre-existing categories. In your budget narrative, make sure to include these categories, flush them out. So again, even though it's just kind of a really brief list here in the budget spreadsheet, you'll want to list each one of these subcategories out and have a description for each one of the subcategories explaining the total for each one, not just the total for overall section F. So for instance, the $300 of consultant services would need a corresponding section that tells us you're hiring a one-time consultant for X amount of money, maybe a designer or contractor that costs a certain amount of money that helps with social media or something like that. And then examples of costs that are not allowable. Sheila covered these earlier, I believe, but just to reiterate, cost of entertainment, can't take your whole team out to the movies or go to, throw a party. Personal expenses, can't pay for you to get your tires changed, something like that. Alcoholic beverages and membership dues. Those are kind of specific at the end there. And so just keeping in mind that those are not allowable. All right. So now back to the budget justification and how that might look. So here we have an example of materials and supplies. So, for this particular project, we will need a full color NLM banner for on-site signage, so we can, use it to discuss educational materials with people. Funds requested for that. We need workbooks. We anticipate needing 50 to 100 participants will be interacting. We need this many workbooks, so we have a total for that. So again, this is not encompassing everything that you could request under materials and supplies. These are just very basic examples of what could be requested. So don't limit yourself by what this example shows. This is just to show you examples of what it could look like. So again, materials and supplies, we need workbooks, we need banners. All right, cool. For publication costs, we're going to print out a poster that will summarize the outcomes of this project. We need funds for that. Consultant services, we're going to have a speaker, a prorated keynote speaker fee attached to that. And we've got a letter of commitment saying that the speaker is going to be a speaker for us, so we need this much funds. So, just making sure that each section is broken down, broken out in the budget justification, and precisely explaining what each section is going to have, what items you're going to have under each section. And then having the subtotals there and then adding it all together for the entirety of section F. All right, so section F is kind of a lot. So if anyone has any questions, don't be afraid to ask. I do have a note here that, the ADP computer section, that one's a little tricky because most of the time you can't request something like a computer for a project unless that computer is 100% used for that project. But computers are pretty expensive anyhow. And so a lot of times, most of this ADP computer service section is just used like, let's say someone is doing some sort of like data visualization project that uses like I don't know, some sort of geographical component. You might use ArcGIS, and so you might need to purchase that software package. So that might be an example of how you utilize the ADP computer services section. All right, so here is the budget justification section of the contract, sorry, the subcategory of subawards, consortium, and contractual costs. Ooh, it's a tongue twister. All right, so for this section, we just have an example of that, we need a graphic designer, and this designer from such and such firm will help us to create graphics for the program materials. And we'll make sure that all these materials comply with all of the necessary requirements for this project, you know, continue on. And the funds requested. One thing that I'll mention here is that NNLM, because we are funded via the government, we require that all of the documentation or deliverables or whatever it is that you're printing or making is 508 compliant if it's in a digital format. And so that means if you have, slides that you're giving out or handouts, they need to be 508 compliant because they need to be accessible. And so if you have questions about that, let us know. And also, accessibility is a section that was covered in the grants webinar that we had in January 22nd, and you can access that through the recording. Our data science strategist does a short section at the end that covers accessibility and 508 compliance. All right, so again, for contractual costs, if you have a contract with someone, so in this example, we said it was a designer, they'd probably go under this section. You might need to discuss that with your budget or accounting office or your equivalent to an OSP office. So we have an office that's called, there's a general office in a lot of universities. It's called the Office of Sponsored Projects or Office of Sponsored Programs. And so OSP for short. And so, we would ask our OSP, you could ask your OSP if you don't have an OSP, likely your budget or accounting offices. You can ask them about how you might contract with someone to do a certain job for your project. And so again, you'll want to add that information into this section, have it fleshed out, describe what they're doing and describe how what they're doing is beneficial to the project. All right. Okay, so continuing on with other direct costs, and we're almost to the finish line on this section. There's equipment or facility rental and user fees. This one, again, equipment tends to be like the large items of like over $5,000. Facility rental, we had an example of a project where they were going to the community and they were renting out a space to be able to hold their community events. So that may or may not be something that's being used. Shipping costs, again, if you're shipping things out for outreach purposes, that can be put under here. So again, we're just listing out the different justifications of why you would need to ship something. Where is it being shipped to? Is there a vendor who's doing the shipping? What kind of materials are being shipped? So you'll want to put all those details into the budget justification section. And then all of the funds requested for each of those sections. And as you're going through these sections of the budget justification, you'll want to have your subtotals listed out, and then you'll want to list the total of all those at the bottom of each section. So this section would have its own total, right? All right. So that was the whole other direct cost section. So now we're moving into indirect costs, which is a different section. So indirect costs is often referred to as IDC. Sometimes people will call it FNA, Facilities Administration, indirect IDC. There's a couple different terms for it. And this was discussed again in the previous webinar, so I won't go too far into it. But what I will say is that if you're at an academic institution, it is very likely that your institution will already have negotiated a federal rate with the government. And so they will have designated rates. There will be a sheet that you can ask your OSP, and they will have different rates for different situations. A lot of times, outreach and education projects, not all the times though, but sometimes they will be designated under like an other project section because a lot of times we'll have research projects and research projects will have a higher IDC rate. Other research projects might have a different rate than that. So you'll want to consult with your institution and ask if you have a designated percentage for your IDC rate already negotiated. And if you do, what type or what level of that you fit in, your project will fit in. So you can look that up. If you are perhaps not an academic institution, your organization may not have preset IDC rates already negotiated. And so in that case, you can use a 10% rate, and it's called the de minimis rate. So de minimis just means that, we're just going to use this 10% because there isn't a pre-negotiated rate. So why do we need IDC? What is IDC? So IDC is useful essentially for purchasing things that aren't covered by the direct costs funding. And so IDC really is something that is meant to go to your institution to cover like not even incidentals. It's more like, if you're in an office and you have electricity on and trash service, trash is being taken out, something needs to account for all of that. And if you're working on this project, that means that you're utilizing all those things. But it's very difficult for your organization to say how much all of that costs for the time that your project is going. So it's really hard for an organization to say, well, for this particular project that you're doing, you are using $70 of electricity and $30 of the trash service. Like your university is probably, or your organization, your community organization, just might not have the time or ability to break it down that far. And so that's kind of what IDC is for. IDC goes to the institution that is where the project is being conducted, and it's to help pay for those essentially like facilities incidentals to help your organization cover those things so that you can work on your project and that you don't have to worry about, oh, well, we can't work on a project because we didn't pay for the electricity, that kind of stuff. So that's really what IDC is meant for. And it gets more complicated, but I'll just kind of leave it at that. And so your institution, again, will decide your IDC rate and how much you get of the IDC rate. So depending on your institution might send your IDC rate in different percentages to different departments across your campus. So some of it might go to your Office of Sponsored Projects, some might go to your research department, some might go to your department chair or your if you're at a center or something like that, might go to whoever the lead person is for their purposes and funding. You might get a percentage of that back into your department, so you'll want to ask where the IDC is going and how it's being used. If you get a percentage back of that IDC, if you get any of it, then you can use some of that to purchase some of these items that aren't necessarily under the direct cost list. And so all that to say is that these are questions you'll probably very likely need to ask your organization. Do you have an IDC cost rate? If you do, what percentage would apply to your project? And then three, do you do you get any of that percentage to use? Those are kind of the three main questions when it comes to IDC. So for the budget purposes, we have indirect cost rate. Just for example, we just put in the de minimis rate of 10%. And here's one other thing I will say for this section is that sometimes we have submissions where people will calculate the IDC based on the total award total and not their actual project total. And what I mean by that is that, we're looking at this project. So for this particular example, we have the total direct costs so far is 22,725. So we will take 10% of that number, and that's how we get our total funds requested for IDC, which is 2,273. What we've seen a mistake in the past is that people will look at our award. So we have an award that's for 25,000. They will say, oh, 25,000. I'll do 10% of 25,000 because that's the word total and I get IDC of 2,500. That's not how it works, unfortunately. It's 10% of how much your actual budget is requesting, not 10% of how much the award total maximum is. So again, you'll want to do 10% of your actual total direct costs. Not the max award number is irrelevant when it comes to calculating your IDC costs. All right, so you can see here that for our award here, we were aiming to make an example that was filling out an application for our $25,000 award. And so you can see that we worked really hard to try and get as close as we possibly could to the 25,000. But what you have to account for is that for our awards, the 25,000 includes the totals of both the direct costs and IDC costs combined. So it's not 25,000 for your direct costs and then you get IDC on top of that. Although some other funders might do that. For ours, they both have to combined come below or be equal to the 25,000. So you can see there that we tried really hard to get it to be there. And so our total direct costs ended up being around 22,000. And then with our indirect costs, we still fell just $2 under the 25,000, which is good because you want to either meet or be below the total award amount. You can't go over, unfortunately. All right. And so then you'll want to total all up in the budget justification. You'll want to add up all of the subtotals and subcategories of your direct costs, and you'll want to add up, calculate and add up your IDC, add that all up together in your total and direct costs total at the bottom. Make sure to have that total and direct costs number at the bottom. Again, another mistake we've seen is people will have their total direct requested, their indirect requested, and then leave it there, and they won't necessarily put the total at the bottom. And that just makes it harder for the funder to see what you're actually asking for. Sorry, once again, my mouse is being funny. Okay. Anyway, so you'll want to make sure to include the total number and not exceed the award total number as well. All right. Okay, so that pretty much is the walkthrough of the budget form. So what I will do is I will stop the recording in a second, and then if you feel more comfortable asking questions once we've stopped the recording, I will let you know.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.